The church had always been a willing partner in developing international relations. Missionaries attached to armies and merchants were able to help due to their high level of education, language skills, and their ambition to spread the gospel. Jesuits and other resourceful missionaries were able to help in other ways too, primarily in the name of God, but often in the interests of their own countries.
A young French missionary arrived in Cochin, China in 1765. He served the Catholics of Hatien despite war and persecution, for which he was consecrated as the Bishop of Adran. So little danger did the Cochin Chinese king apprehend from a man who professed a different religion from that of his own, that he placed his only son under Adran's tuition. In 1774, 3 peasant brothers led a rebellion. In the first burst of the revolt, the king was already in the power of the rebels, but Adran helped the queen, the young prince, with his own wife and infant son escape. They took refuge in a forest for several months. The young king of Cochin China concealed himself and the remnants of his unfortunate family in the shady branches of a banyan tree, whose sacred character to the Cochin Chinese rendered it more secure. Adran oversaw procurement of ships and munitions, but despite the young king's great coolness and intrepidity, they were overpowered by numbers and had to escape again. The king committed his eldest son to the care of Adran, who took his leave, and they arrived in Paris in 1787. The young prince was presented at court and treated with every mark of attention and respect, and the project of the missionary was so highly approved that a treaty was drawn up between Louis XVI and the King of Cochin China, signed at Versailles. The principal articles of this extraordinary treaty were an offensive and defensive alliance between the kings of France and Cochin China, 20 French warships, 5 European regiments, and $1 million, half in silver, and the rest in military aid. In return for permanent bases in Cochin China, for consuls and shipbuilding, with timber rights and possession of the Bay of Turon.
The religious tolerance which the King of Cochin China had shown to the Christians was something that John Barrow had seen elsewhere. On his visit to Batavia, the Dutch colony, he saw that the Chinese people, who had been there since 1412, now faced new restrictions under their Dutch rulers. But they still allowed the Malays and the Javanese people to worship their own gods in the Chinese temple, and anybody was free to use the Chinese hospital, which was paid for by firework shows. News had finally reached the king of this area, Kong Shung, about the presence of the British. Lord Macartney still hadn't stepped off the ship. He knew that as soon as he set foot on shore, it would trigger a large party, and so he diplomatically chose the 4th of June, the young king's birthday. The king responded well, sending food and drink aplenty. And by way of an apology, Manuel Duomo asked if he could arrange the food, thinking that he, being a European, he'd be able to satisfy the English tastes. John Barrow reports that excellent Cochin Chinese entertainment was entirely marred by a bad Portuguese dinner. And it wasn't the only disappointment of the day. In fact, the British were about to commit a cultural faux pas that would haunt the rest of the mission.
A trifling circumstance occurred on our first entering the building. These people who, on most occasions, adopt the Chinese customs, had prepared a yellow screen of silk bearing in large printed characters the name of the king. When the general commanding at Turon, who sat cross-legged on a bench as proxy for his master, observed that, having made our bow, we filed off and took our seats regardless of the yellow screen. He appeared to be greatly disconcerted. His disappointment in missing the 9 prostrations seemed to operate on his mind, which was rather embarrassing to the Cochin Chinese officers.